Our next panel is going to be on legislative updates. They're going to talk about what's working in other states and what's not working in other states, which is extremely timely with some of the stuff going on at the Florida Supreme Court right now. The moderator is going to be Matthew Ginder. He's a senior counsel in the Cannabis Law Practice Group at Greenspoon Marder. Mr. Ginder represents various cannabis and hemp-related businesses where he assists in many areas of the industry, including licensing, regulatory and compliance, and business transactions. He also represents ancillary businesses who provide products or services to the cannabis industry and advises individuals, investors, lenders, startups, and large corporations on direct and indirect participation in state legal cannabis markets. In 2016, Mr. Ginder co-founded a nonprofit organization called the Organization for Safe Cannabis Regulation, which advocates on behalf of cannabis-related businesses in Florida. He also represents the firm as a founding member of the National Cannabis Roundtable, chaired former House Speaker John Boehner. Mr. Matt Ginder.
Thank you. I guess panelists, come on out. We have a diverse group of panelists today, so we're going to cover various topics. I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves. Thank you. So we have Ricardo Alvarez, Eric Stevens, Shanel, Lindsay, and Ruben, Honig. So if you just want to each introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about your professional background and how it relates to cannabis and hemp. Starting.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Ricardo Alvarez. I'm the South Florida Regional Director for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I'm the Commissioner of Agriculture's representative here in South Florida. My background is in sustainable agriculture, community development. Huh? Hello?
You can pick it up.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Better.
Hello. Okay. So, from the beginning. From the beginning, my name is Ricardo Alvarez. I'm the South Florida Regional Director for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, representing the Office of the Commissioner of Agriculture, Nikki Freed. As a South Florida Regional Director, I oversee the hemp rollout, the industrial hemp program rollout here in South Florida, as well as act as a conduit between the community and everything that has to do with our program. My background, as I was mentioning, is in sustainable agriculture, community development, and agroforestry. My previous experiences with cannabis was as a patient, a caretaker, and a grower in Oregon, where I grew for a patient collective to ensure safe access to medicine.
Great. Thank you guys, and thank you for having me. Eric Stevens. I got started in cannabis policy. I'm originally from Massachusetts. I was going to school down here in Miami, and we had a couple different marijuana policy questions that were on the ballot for decriminalization and then medical marijuana. So I started interning and working with some of the teams up in Massachusetts, trying to bring that policy to Florida. I then subsequently worked on both medical marijuana constitutional amendment campaigns here in Florida, and then subsequently working on its continued implementation, looking at what's worked, what hasn't, and now I've been working with a testing lab and doing some business development, as well as the Florida Hemp Council, some trade association work, and things like that. Thank you.
Shanel.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hello? Can you hear me? My name's Shanel Lindsay. I'm also from Massachusetts. My company is named Ardent. I developed a technology that allows people to make different cannabis products and brought that product to market. Definitely go check us out downstairs in our booth. On the policy side, I am an attorney. I was one of the authors of the Adult Use Initiative in Massachusetts legalizing cannabis for adults, and was appointed by the treasurer to the Massachusetts Cannabis Advisory Board. So over these last 2 years, and I was just recently reappointed to that position, we've been working to develop the regulations around the adult use market. So it's been very interesting to see the interplay between what's happening with medical and adult use in Massachusetts. So very excited to talk with you guys about that today.
Ruben?
Good morning, everybody. Ruben Honig, Executive Director of the United Cannabis Business Association. We are a trade association that represents licensed retailers in the city of Los Angeles and across California, working on policy work in Sacramento statewide in California, as well as municipally in the city of LA. Ironically, from Massachusetts also. Moved out to Los Angeles for safe access. I was actually living in Florida, and I had a autoimmune disorder resolve with the use of THC and CBD, and had to commit a federal crime to be able to get better. So I moved out to California for safe access to Los Angeles, became involved on the operator side in the industry, and then realized that there was, as state law was coming down and municipal law was coming down, that there was a lot of work to be done on the advocacy side. So that's the main work that I've done throughout California and in LA.
Thanks. Thanks all. I just want to start with Eric. Can you just provide everybody with a snapshot of where legalization stands throughout the country right now?
Yeah, so things have, I would say they basically almost tripled in the number of states that have had access. Just over the past few years, we've got 33 now with medical. We've got even more than that have some form of low THC, hemp policies that they've been working on separate from when the Farm Bill. And then we've got 11 with adult use markets. We've got Illinois coming online here soon, and we've got a lot of states that are working through what that means from when a initiative is passed, which has been the route of most of these. They've needed signatures gathered, and then a certain percentage has to vote, and then it's implementation by a state bill, and then rulemaking that will come from there. Illinois, one of the few adult use that's come legislatively versus from the Citizens Initiative. And so it's going to be interesting to see how these all continue to move forward. There's groups that are working to try and get that on the ballot down here as well. And so, but we still need to get 60% to get that passed in Florida, which is different than any state that's ever passed adult use anywhere. So that's going to need a massive campaign to make sure that is something that's going to be smartly educated on and passed, because there's going to be opposition, and that's the most difficult task, I think.
We're going to take a deeper dive into Florida, but first I did want to discuss, and that was a good point, most states that have legalized it to date have been through ballot initiatives, but we're seeing a recent trend of legislative initiatives. The state, not waiting for citizens to speak, but taking proactive measures. I think we saw that in Illinois. The next trend is going to be in the Northeast. There's some talks in the Northeast. So Shanel, can you just briefly talk about what's going on in the Northeast between, amongst those states?
Absolutely. I think we've seen a huge trend since medical implementation in 2012 in Massachusetts, followed by adult use and its effect on all of the states around. So now you have Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine has also legalized. And after Massachusetts legalized for adult use, we saw a huge interest in the legislatures of our surrounding states about what was going to happen, right? With Massachusetts kind of being central to everything, people started flocking to the state in order to try to get cannabis, which is another story because there aren't a lot of dispensaries open. But just the fact that people were allowed to grow at home, to gift, there was just a lot of cannabis around. And I think that places like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut really have started to wake up to the fact that legalization is coming one way or another. And so I went down to testify in New York and in Connecticut to the legislature. There's a lot of movement in both places. In fact, I think many of us thought New York was going to push forward legalization last session, and in the kind of 11th hour, things kind of fell apart. And I think a lot of that was based on the fact that equity is becoming a real priority in legalization frameworks, and New York really didn't address that. I think that it's really interesting to see now the tri-state governors coming together and talking about having some kind of regional cannabis policy. That's very new, and I think it makes a lot of sense because having different frameworks and regimes is going to lead to what we've seen now, which is a rush to the border for different states. And I think that the Northeast is looking to kind of avoid that and try to come up with something that makes sense for the entire region. So that will be interesting to see that play out over the next year or so.
Yeah, that's definitely something new, seeing states discuss regional policy instead of this unique state-by-state basis that we've seen. So that's going to be interesting to play out. Here in Florida, we don't have the luxury of the legislature being progressive like they are out west and soon to be in the Northeast. So any reform in the short term for adult use is going to be through a ballot initiative in this state. So there are two currently that are looking to try to get on the ballot for 2020. Eric, do you want to discuss the two ballot initiatives in the state?
Yeah, so I haven't delved too deeply into all this different specifics between them, but there's essentially two groups that are working. From my understanding, one includes a home grow allowance. One does not specifically include that. And the main thing in Florida is they're both up for they've both gotten more signatures to get constitutional Supreme Court review and approval, and I think that's the most important thing in this state. Once you collect a certain percentage of the needed signatures in the state, it goes for a constitutional review, where they have to check it for its single subject nature, that it's not going to be deceiving to the voters, and a variety of other issues. And so that's kind of the process that we're at now. But understand, in Florida, you need to gather almost 1 million signatures to get this on the ballot. To get that Supreme Court review, you need about 100,000 signatures. And so I know that they are out there working for that. And to whichever can get it on the ballot, it is not a small feat by any means. And it is going to require way more effort to get it passed than it will to get it on the ballot, because of all the things that I mentioned, all the different groups that may come out against this. I don't see our governor's already come out and said that he's not in favor of this. And so when you don't have the elected officials with your back, and then you have negative ads that may come out one way or the other, it's going to take a very smart, educated push to get something like that passed with 60%. So all the power and effort to them, but that's the reality of where we stand. And then our legislature, instead of doing good things to improve medical patients policies, we have the majority of our House of Representatives talking about regressive policies and psychosis and limiting percentages of THCs. And instead of us getting more productive changes to our patient registry or reciprocity or protections for employment and things like that, we haven't been able to have those discussions because we've been too busy discussing all these other things and trying to give more evidence back on those. And so that's kind of the situation we stand in. I would hope that our state legislature would see the potential benefits from a revenue standpoint, and take some initiative on this one way or the other, seeing that the people want this. And so I see us getting there eventually, and I hope it's sooner than later.
Since we have such a diverse panel, I do want to talk about what states have been doing right and what states have been doing wrong. We were joking just prior in California. Ruben mentioned that the conversation about what they've been doing right in California may be a short conversation, but
I didn't say that.
So I just want to go down the line. We'll start with Ruben and talk about each respective state that you work in, and talk about what they've done right, and then we'll talk about the opposite afterward.
I think that I kind of like to break this up into legalization versus implementation, right? So What California did great is in 2016, the voters passed Prop 64, which on November 1st, 2018 went into effect, legalizing cannabis, the adult use, sale, and commercial cannabis activity throughout the supply chain, which was great. What's interesting about California too is that, the state is massive, and it's almost like 3 states, right? There's Northern California that is very, very grower centric, Central California as well, and then Southern California, which is very retail centric. What's always good for one, especially in a nascent industry that's developing, isn't great for another. So that has been a difficult part of the conversation. But I want to stay on the pros, especially in the city of Los Angeles and California as it's developing. As Shanel was talking about, has really prioritized equity. The issue with that has been so far in implementation of social equity programs across the state, but there are finally grants and money flowing to cities to help fund equity programs, and really trying to figure out what truly could be beneficial for municipalities and for California in general. I think that in California they have created an infrastructure that if there wasn't issues such as 70 to 80% of municipalities banning commercial cannabis activity outright would develop more if there were more retail outlets. I'll get into that when there are the cons. It's not so hard pros and cons. It's just it's a more complicated conversation than just legalizing cannabis, especially in California where medical has been legal since 1996, largely unregulated. So there have been a lot of great things with that when it comes to access and it comes to patients getting their medicine. And on the other side, there's a lot of bad habits that have been learned over the years that the regulatory process is trying to undo, but it's not just an overnight thing. So there's a lot to be done. Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles is like a state of its own. The county of Los Angeles is like a country of its own. It's interesting to be in Florida actually, because Florida is, and I'm not saying it's one market versus another market state-wise, but Florida is a very large market, and has really can look at California and be part of that conversation and see, all right, well, what did California do well, what they did not do well, and I don't believe that California, they did have examples of Colorado, Washington, Oregon, previous to that to look at, but I think that it was hard because there were not industries developing that were of a scale that they were comparable to that. It was a different scale. So I really believe that Florida can do a great job of learning from California and working directly with California as it pushes towards legalization.
You want to touch upon Massachusetts, what they've done right over there?
Absolutely. And Ruben hit the nail on the head when it comes to equity, and also the difference between what's in the law and the implementation of the law. And that is, I think, the biggest chasm that exists in all cannabis, systems, is you can have an amazing law on paper, and then the implementation is just so far from what you expected. And that's what happened with us in medical, right? The medical law, the rules the regulations that were made, promulgated around the medical law look nothing like the actual law itself. So I think the one thing in Massachusetts that we did right was when we were writing the adult use law, number one, we made a real focus on equity. We got a small bit of language in the original law that talked about prioritizing communities harmed by prohibition, and that's what we mean when we talk about cannabis equity, right? It's not equality, right? When we're talking in the general sense, we're talking about the specific harms that have occurred because of cannabis prohibition over generations to certain communities. And those communities are largely black and brown and poor communities. And when we look at the legal cannabis industry coming in and the money that is related to that, and the fact that cannabis is a wealth generator primarily because it has been illegal for so long and now is part of a regulated market that makes it very, very expensive and lucrative, we all have an obligation to make sure that the communities that have been harmed actually participate in this industry. And so in Massachusetts, I think we did a great job of that, getting that first into the regulation, which is into the law, which is very important. And then we started a nonprofit, Equitable Opportunities Now, and over the last 4 years have pushed to protect and defend those provisions and really have the leading equity statewide program in the nation. And we're very proud of that piece. Similar to that, what we saw in Massachusetts under our medical law was that there was a huge monopoly because only people that had literally 500,000 liquid cash in the bank were able to apply for licenses under our medical program. It was also a $30,000 application fee, non-refundable. And so you can imagine no regular people were actually allowed to have cannabis businesses. So when we were writing the adult use law, we made sure that those fees were very low, so it's a maximum of $1,500 to apply. There is no requirement of a particular amount of capital, and there are many, many different license types. So I think that that's very important in a regulated system to have, and what I mean by different license type is in the grow. There are different tiers of growing levels, all the way from 1,000 square feet up to 100,000 square feet, and there are caps as well at 100,000, so that there can be a marketplace where more people can participate there. There's also a co-op model on the grower side, so you can allow smaller farmers to band together and act as an enterprise. And so I think that those are really, really important parts of our adult use system that makes Massachusetts special. And we also have caps on the number of licenses a particular group can have. And that's something we saw that was very, very important to make sure that we had a diverse participation in Massachusetts. Lastly, there are also several provisions within the law itself that require us as an advisory board and the commission to look at and make sure that there is participation by farmers, by women, by underrepresented groups. And I think without that real focus and legal hook for that piece, it really becomes an afterthought. So I would really encourage folks that are working on legislation and regulations to make sure that those really important pieces are part of their system.
Want to touch upon Florida and what they did right?
Yeah. So I guess Florida went through an interesting process in where all their licensees are and still are vertically integrated, meaning that, for those of you who don't know, they need to do everything from seed to sale, meaning they're growing, they're processing, and they're opening now 35 plus retail stores, marketing, etc., all within that company. And so obviously that doesn't lead to as many small businesses or opportunities in different market types as there may be in other states. But they originally had 5 license holders under a low THC program, and they tried to implement that alongside a constitutional amendment. There have been a variety of constitutional challenges because of the differences between the bills and what the Constitution says, and those will continue to play out. And then there's the public policy discussion that goes on with legislators, in which they restricted types of medicine that was available. They didn't allow whole flower until our organization sued them for over 2 years, and barely earlier this year we finally got flower sales available. And immediately the week after, they tried to limit them to 10% or less. And so, we're fighting a variety of battles on educating on what this is, on educating why it's medical, on educating the different business types, on educating on the different social equity areas that we should be having. And so it's been a larger issue for our legislature to fully just understand. I think they're at least at the point now that they understand this, but they're battling what do they do in finding a balance between having as many licenses as could be out there and having a marijuana store on every corner, and what the communities want and how to balance. Right now it's been you either have to ban or treat these like pharmacies. I think they did a great job in getting our ID cards out to patients once that got moving. Eventually, initially that was a huge drawback. Not only did you, with the bills that they wrote, have to have a pre-existing relationship of 3 months with your physician, but they were taking a huge amount of time to get people's cards and things. And there's still issues with that, but we've had over 300,000 people that have signed up as patients here in the past 2 years. And so I think that there's a lot of good things that have been done with that. And so they're going to have to continue to look at how is this going to look? But right now, we've got 23 vertical license holders, all of which can open, more than 30 retail stores, some more than that based on previous laws, and the retail part of that sunsets later this year, meaning that the retail would be open to wherever they could go essentially at that point. And so we'll see what happens here in the future. But when you're having conversations about 10% THC and a variety of other things, it's hard to progress things in a positive direction. But we're hoping that we're going to get there. So.
Ricardo, I promise you we will get to hemp. We can't really discuss what's right and wrong because the program still hasn't been implemented, but I will compliment the department, the pace that they are moving with the rule development and really getting ahead of things, having open hearings, being transparent, notifying the public, keeping them informed. I think it's been very impressive to see what's going on.
Yes, thank you. One of the main things that we definitely wanted to do was to get this program out as rapidly and as effectively as possible. As Eric mentioned, with medical marijuana here in the state of Florida, there's a vertical integration model, whereas for hemp, there will be no vertical integration model. One can get into the chain wherever you want, depending on what your interest is. Also, the relative low cost of the program as well is encouraging, which will also help with the social equity aspect of it. I think, it has been impressive as to how we as an agency and, being a government agency and everything like that, how quickly we've acted. And that is really a credit to the leadership of Commissioner Freed and to the commitment of the department to make it a reality for the citizens of Florida.
There's some great policy behind laws and regulations on the books. However well-intentioned, it's a whole nother story when you're implementing that policy, laws and regulations. So let's talk about California, and we'll go down the line again about, where, especially during the implementation phase, where have been the bottlenecks, what have been the issues in California as they've, fairly recently rolled out the program and still working out the kinks.
Sure. Well, I'll get to the issues, but I can speak to them very clearly in what our legislative priorities are for 2020, and then you can see where the issues are and what is hindering the development of the commercial cannabis industry in California. In no specific order, priorities for us in 2020 and obviously through the end of this year are going to be number one, tax reform. The consumer is paying too much to go to a licensed dispensary. With a 15% excise tax at the state, plus, as an example, the city of Los Angeles and every city can set their own tax rates and they're, through ballot initiative, but LA has a 10% tax on top of that, plus 9.5% that consumers are going to get normally. So minimum shopping at a dispensary is 34% in the city of Los Angeles at a licensed dispensary. Add the cost of compliance, these shops need to sign labor peace agreements. They're going to potentially be unionized. They have to live up to certain labor standards. There's also taxation through the supply chain that also gets baked into the consumer. So you're seeing 50% increase in the cost of patients either getting their medicine or consumers going to a store. Conversely, which is another issue, enforcement. The illicit market, especially in the city of Los Angeles, is at least 4-to-1 licensed delivery services and brick and mortar retail to unlicensed, who are not charging tax, who are, it's just that really. I have an example. Is I have a member that's an operator in a region of Los Angeles. He has one licensed dispensary in that region, and he's surrounded by 14 illicit operators, and that's just brick and mortar, not delivery services. And he actually has people who are operating out of shipping containers, but the city has not prioritized enforcement, and the state has not necessarily prioritized it because it's, what the way that it's being seen is that people are trying to come into compliance, and it's a very underdeveloped market. And when I say underdeveloped market, a third priority is the responsible expansion of the retail footprint across the state. Right now, the state could minimum hold 3,000, 3 to 6,000 retailers, be them brick and mortar or delivery services. There's about between 8 and 900 right now. A lot of manufacturers were prepared coming into 2018 with their infrastructure built out. They were previous to that selling to 3 to 6,000 stores, and then they had to be funneled into 500, 600. It's developing right very slowly. And the reason why it's developing so slowly is because there's a dual licensing system in California. You need to have a local authorization to be able to get state licensing. The problem with that is that the municipalities have had a hard time developing these rules. There hasn't necessarily been a baked-in ordinances for them. The cost has been too high, and even if they've passed Prop 64 with resounding numbers, 60, 70%, they're still banning it. Their city councils and their county supervisors are still banning it. And when you have 482 cities and 58 counties in California, which are all responsible to making their own rules, you can see where that bottleneck is. So it's going to take a grand effort. On the tax reform side, I'll be fully honest, Democrats don't love to lower taxes. We've had a tax bill the last 2 years, and it has failed in the legislature. It's obviously going to take a bit more muscle this year. I think that there are, in the business environment, as a store is tough, as a producer it's tough, as a cultivator it's tough being funneled into the state system. But right now, similar to what Shanel was saying about businesses of certain sizes being able to survive, there's a certain tranche of businesses right now that are on the ropes right now in California. And even the medium to larger size businesses are laying off employees, downsizing, and trying to figure these things out. So really the health of the entire market is going to really center around these priorities that we're doing, not only municipally, but also statewide. And it's going to be an evolving conversation, but stay tuned to California.
Thanks. Shanel, you want to touch upon Massachusetts?
Absolutely. And just going back to our last question, one of the things that Massachusetts absolutely did right was allowing home grow. And I think from an activist perspective, home grow is an essential part of any cannabis framework. Without it, you're going to still be criminalizing people for growing small amounts of marijuana. And so I think Massachusetts really did that right, and we are very proud to defend our right to grow in Mass. On to the problems. Massachusetts is having the same issue with local approvals. So in Massachusetts, there's something called the HCA, a Community Host Agreement, and they are very, very difficult to get. There's a lot of not in my backyard going on in Massachusetts, similar to California. More than half of the cities and towns have just put an outright ban on cannabis coming into the town. And so it makes it very difficult. It makes it very competitive in the towns that have allowed it. We have very large buffer zones required between businesses, and it makes it very difficult for people to find properties between the buffer zones and the zoning that is implemented at the local level. Another big problem that we're starting to see is the standards for growing are tilted towards indoor growing in Massachusetts. And what we're finding is that a lot of outdoor farmers are not able to pass the microbial tests because when they are being implemented, these rules, they're not taking into account beneficial bacteria and microbes that are necessary from outside. And so I think that we are starting to see a big push from the organic growing set and from the outdoor farmers to make sure that these rules are going to allow them to thrive and provide good product for the marketplace. So I think that's another big challenge that we're facing in Massachusetts. Equity is a huge issue. You can have great policy on paper. We have priority for retail licenses, but you have to make sure when you are implementing equity rules that you're looking at them holistically and how they will relate to the other rules that you already have in play. So for example, in Massachusetts, in our law, the medical licensees also had equity at the same tier as social economic empowerment applicants. And so when you're looking at a city or a town and they have to decide between 2 or 3 people coming in, certainly they're going to pick the medical operator who has been in business for several years, that has millions of dollars behind them. And so we're really trying to find a way to make sure equity is prioritized at the local level as well. And then finally, we have the issue of social consumption. In Massachusetts, it's been an issue for a very long time since medical has come into play. It's really a double-edged sword, right? You're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. People say that they don't want people smoking out on the street, but at the same time, they don't want social consumption lounges. And so in Massachusetts, our commission has allowed these licenses, but there was a flaw in the law that would require a new ballot initiative at the local level at every single city or town to allow social consumption. And so you can imagine that that's going to be an uphill battle for us, and I wish that that had been more thoroughly attended to when we were drafting the law.
Thank you, Shanel. Eric, you want to talk briefly about some of the issues in Florida, and then we're going to switch over because I do want to talk about hemp. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've touched on a good amount of them, but I think, when we look, I mean, we're having similar issues, that I think a lot of you are speaking of. We have a ton of municipalities. They weren't sure what to do. A lot of them took the initial, well, we'll ban it for now. Let's wait and see what this looks like, or who else around us, gets them versus not. And, now, and they're also looking at the amount of and types of businesses from a vertical and what was allowed, and the smaller businesses that weren't able to get involved. I mean, when our state passed its medical marijuana law, the low THC program, the only way that you could apply if you were a farmer here was you needed to be a 30-year consecutive nurseryman, and also to have been growing currently over 400,000 plants on your property. And that was thrown in on the House floor, the good old House, at the 11th hour when that bill was moving forward after a variety of parents had gone up to Tallahassee and advocated for their children. And so, we're still facing some of those issues and how we get to what the finality of that system will look like. There's been litigation on our vertical, horizontal for a long time, and that's because of the Constitutional Amendment says or. They wrote the bill to say and, meaning you had to do all of those things versus pick the ones you wanted. And so, those things continue to move forward, and the litigation is a far longer process than anyone, I think, than I definitely could have ever imagined. And the rulemaking process with the state is as well. And so to allow the ability and have emergency rulemaking powers and other things like that to fix some of these issues when they come into play, I think is helpful. And to just continue to try and educate and revisit these things because they don't go away. As you can see from the markets that have been around a lot longer and are moving forward quicker, they're still facing a lot of these same issues.
Yeah, the pace in Florida's implementation, particularly in rulemaking, has been slower than expected, leaving a fairly large program that has some holes in it with respect to regulation. So that has been a challenge here in Florida.
I spoke to 29-year farmers that were unable to get involved and are still trying to and looking for new ways to deal with citrus freezes and everything else. And I think that's something we need to have the opportunity for, especially in our agricultural sunshine state.
Yep. Yeah, we are a very large ag state. A year ago at this conference, I don't think hemp was really a topic worth newsworthy, at least in Florida. A few months after, December of 2018, the 2018 Farm Bill was signed into law, and I think that was a game changer for a state, particularly like Florida. So 2018 Farm Bill basically legalized the commercial use of hemp. Since then, we've seen a divergence in the laws, and hemp is traveling on a separate track as an agricultural commodity, no longer under the umbrella of a federal illegal controlled substance. Following the passage of that 2018 Farm Bill, we're seeing a lot of states implement their own commercial hemp programs. Here in Florida, a few months ago, we passed a hemp bill. So we are currently in the process of working on the rules, as I mentioned. So Ricardo, if you want to discuss Florida's soon-to-be robust hemp program in the state.
Yes, so correct. As you mentioned, I mean, we've gone from zero to hero in a very short time when it comes down to the industrial hemp program. When you consider the fact that in March of this year, the University of Florida, IFAS, was just starting their pilot project, and that went from July 1st, when the governor had signed SB 1020 into law, to now having rulemaking, to the last two workshops for rulemaking ending, and now we have the final round of public commentary available, which will end October 31st. And then from there, you know, barring no other issues, we should see full implementation by the holidays. So that's encouraging. I mean, it's been challenging, you know. As we all know, the legislature tends to be difficult, and it's been a real uphill battle, but we've managed to, you know, the department has managed to make this a reality as quick as possible, and to just make it as accessible as possible as well.
You see that we've talked about the difficulties in rolling out programs. Do you see any issues? I know we're going to see a flood of, there already is a flood of interest, but there's going to be a flood of applicants looking to cultivate hemp in the state. So do you foresee any issues or certain things that, you know, those potential hemp growers could get ahead of in advance of implementation?
Well, for sure. I mean, we expect an explosion of, you know, not just interest, but of applicants of all sorts and of all kinds. And that being said, we in the department will do our utmost best to make sure that we have everything in place to handle that bulk and to handle that demand. You know, ultimately, we're not going to roll it out without having our capacity, or at least on our end, to deal with it. There are going to always be issues related to anything that comes out, and that's normal. Fortunately, we have a lot of leeway, and the department has made this so that there's room for growth, there's room for change, and there's room for adoption. And you know, ultimately, we'll just work it out as we go along. You know, we're positive as to what this means for the state economically, and what it means for our farmers, and you know, also what it means for our tourist industry, you know, which is our #1 economic driver, and agriculture being our second economic driver. Put those two together, and hemp is just bound to explode here. So, you know, we're bracing ourselves. We're looking forward to it.
Absolutely. We're running a little behind schedule, so to get back on track with the program, we're going to cut it short right now. But I do want to thank the panelists.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about hemp, the Department of Agriculture this afternoon is going to have a breakout from 1 to 4:30 downstairs. We'll be delving into the topic, I think, a lot more. I don't know that we were able to as much here, so just wanted to remind people of that. So,
Thank you very much, panelists.